In 1866, a man named William stood beside 12 oxen in Nebraska City, holding a 20-foot bullwhip in his calloused hands. Behind him, a freight wagon carried 3 tons of supplies, flour, tools, dry goods, mining equipment, bound for Salt Lake City, 1,000 miles away across empty prairie. His pay for the entire journey? $40, maybe $50 if he was lucky. His speed? 2 miles per hour, walking speed. Because he would walk the entire distance beside those oxen, every single mile, through heat and cold, dust and mud, for the next 6 months. This is the story of the bullwhacker, the forgotten men who moved an entire civilization westward, one agonizing ox step at a time. Between 1850 and 1870, before the railroads reached deep into the frontier, everything that went west went by wagon. And I mean everything. Every nail, every window pane, every sack of flour, every tool, every piece of mining equipment, every bolt of cloth, every book, every bottle of whiskey. If you wanted it in Denver or Salt Lake City or Virginia City or any of the hundreds of mining camps and frontier settlements scattered across the West, it had to be loaded onto a wagon in Missouri or Kansas and hauled across hundreds of miles of prairie, desert, and mountains. And the men who drove those wagons, they were called bullwhackers. Not because they whacked the bulls, though that's what everyone assumes. The name came from the crack of their whips, the sound like a rifle shot that drove the oxen forward. A skilled bullwhacker could make that whip-sing commands without ever touching an animal. It was brutal work, low pay, endless monotony, and it was absolutely essential to building the American West. Let's start with why oxen. When you picture a wagon heading west, you probably think of horses pulling it, maybe mules. Yeah, but the reality was different. The majority of freight wagons, especially the heavy commercial operations, were pulled by oxen. Oxen had several advantages that made them perfect for long-haul freighting, even if they were slower than hell. First, they were strong. A team of oxen could pull far more weight than horses or mules of equivalent size. An ox could pull its own body weight consistently, day after day, without breaking down. Horses tired faster under heavy loads. Second, they were cheap. An ox cost about half what a horse cost. For freight companies outfitting wagon trains with dozens or even hundreds of animals, that difference was enormous. Third, and this was crucial on the frontier, you could eat them. If an ox went lame, got sick, or simply wore out, you butchered it and fed the crew. Try that with a horse and you'd have a mutiny. Horse meat was considered disgusting by most Americans, but beef? That was just dinner. Fourth, oxen could survive on prairie grass. Horses and mules needed grain, oats or corn, which meant you had to carry feed, which added weight, which meant you needed more animals, which meant more feed. It was a vicious cycle. Oxen just grazed on whatever grass they could find and kept moving. And fifth, oxen were calmer. They didn't spook as easily as horses. Thunder, gunfire, wolves howling in the darkness. Oxen would keep their heads down and keep pulling. Horses would bolt. Mules would stop dead and refuse to move. The downside? Speed. Or rather, the complete lack of it. A team of oxen pulling a loaded freight wagon moved at about 2 miles per hour. On a good day, with flat terrain and no problems, a bullwhacker might cover 15 to 18 miles. On a bad day, crossing a river, navigating rough terrain, dealing with a broken axle, he might cover 5 miles or none. The journey from Nebraska City to Salt Lake City, about 1,000 miles, took around 6 months, depending on weather, terrain, and luck. That's 6 months of walking beside the wagon, 6 months of eating dust, 6 months of the same landscape crawling past at the speed of a slow walk. And the bullwhacker? He walked every mile of it. Let's talk about the wagon itself. The standard freight wagon was massive, much larger than the Conestoga wagons that settlers used on the Oregon Trail. A freight wagon's bed was typically 16 to 18 feet long and 4 feet wide. The wooden sides were high, sometimes 6 feet, to maximize cargo capacity. The wagon was built entirely of wood. The wheels were wooden with iron rims, no rubber, no cushioning. Every bump, every rock, every rut transmitted directly through the frame. The constant jolting could shake cargo loose, break axles, and crack wheels. The rear wheels were typically 5 to 6 feet in diameter, taller than most men. The front wheels were slightly smaller, about 4 feet, to allow for tighter turning. The wagon bed sat high off the ground to provide clearance over rocks and rough terrain. Getting cargo into the bed required lifting it 4 to 5 feet. A sack of flour weighed 100 pounds. Mining equipment could weigh hundreds of pounds. Everything had to be hoisted up by hand. A fully loaded freight wagon could carry 3 to 4 tons, 6 to 8,000 pounds. Some of the largest wagons, pulled by 16 or 20 oxen, carried up to 6 tons. The tongue of the wagon, the long wooden beam extending forward to connect to the oxen, was often 20 feet long and weighed several hundred pounds by itself. And here's the thing. The bullwhacker had to maintain all of this. The wheels had to be greased regularly to prevent the wooden axles from catching fire from friction. Yes, catching fire. If you forgot to grease the axles, the friction could generate enough heat to ignite the wood. The canvas cover, when there was one, had to be checked for tearing. Ropes securing the cargo had to be inspected and tightened. The tongue had to be examined for cracks. The metal fittings had to be checked for wear, all while walking 15 miles a day beside 12 oxen. Now let's talk about those oxen. A standard freight wagon team consisted of 6 to 12 oxen, depending on the load and terrain. Mountain freighting, crossing the Rockies or the Sierra Nevada, might require 20 oxen for a single wagon. The oxen were yoked in pairs. The yoke was a heavy wooden beam that rested across the necks of 2 oxen, holding them together so they pulled in unison. Each yoke weighed 40 to 60 pounds. The oxen closest to the wagon were called the wheelers. They bore the brunt of the load when stopping or backing up. The middle teams were the swing oxen, and the front pair, the smartest, most reliable oxen, were the leaders. Training oxen was an art form. A good leader ox was worth 3 or 4 times what an ordinary ox cost. These animals understood dozens of verbal commands and could anticipate what the bullwhacker wanted before he even gave the order. Oxen were named always, not because bullwhackers were sentimental, though some were, but because you couldn't drive a team of 12 oxen without being able to call them individually. Buck, Bright, move up, Cherry, hold steady. The commands were loud, constant, and profane. Bullwhackers had a reputation for the most creative cursing on the frontier. The reason for all that cursing? The oxen were far away. The leaders were sometimes 40 feet ahead of the wagon. The bullwhacker had to shout to be heard over the creak of the wagon, the wind, and the noise of the trail. Which brings us to the whip. The bullwhip was the bullwhacker's signature tool, and using it was an art that took years to master. A bullwhacker's whip was typically 18 to 25 feet long, though some were even longer. It consisted of a wooden handle about 18 inches long with a braided rawhide lash attached. At the end of the lash was a thin strip of buckskin called the cracker. The whip weighed only a couple of pounds, but in skilled hands, it was incredibly precise. Here's what most people don't understand. The whip was rarely used to hit the oxen. Hitting them was counterproductive, made them nervous and unpredictable. Instead, the whip was used to create sound. A skilled bullwhacker could crack that whip right next to an ox's ear, close enough to get its attention, but without touching it. The crack, literally a small sonic boom created when the tip broke the sound barrier, sounded like a gunshot and could be heard for miles. Different cracks meant different things. A sharp, quick crack near the leaders meant speed up. A series of cracks along the side of the team meant stay in line. A low, rolling crack behind the wheelers meant push harder. The whip could also be used to flick flies off an ox's back from 20 feet away, or to snap a pebble off the ground and send it skittering forward to get a leader's attention. Learning to use the whip took months of practice. A novice bullwhacker would catch the lash on his own legs, arms, or face. The rawhide could cut skin to the bone. Many bullwhackers had scars crisscrossing their arms and legs, evidence of their apprenticeship. But once mastered, the whip became an extension of the bullwhacker's will. He could communicate with the entire team without ever leaving his position beside the wagon. And where was that position? Always on the left side of the team, walking alongside the oxen. Why the left side? Tradition, mostly, dating back to medieval Europe, but also practical. Most men were right-handed, so walking on the left meant the whip hand was on the outside, away from the wagon, giving more room to work the lash. The bullwhacker never rode on the wagon unless he was injured or sick. Riding was for passengers, not teamsters. A bullwhacker walked, always walked, 15 to 18 miles a day, every day for months. In summer, temperatures on the prairie could reach 100 degrees or higher. The bullwhacker walked in wool clothing. Cotton wasn't common yet. Breathing dust kicked up by 12 oxen and wooden wheels grinding across dry earth. His face would be caked with dirt, his throat raw, his lips cracked and bleeding. In winter, the same journey meant walking through snow and mud, sometimes in temperatures well below zero. Frostbite was common. Many bullwhackers lost toes or fingers to the cold, and the pace never changed. 2 miles per hour, hour after hour, day after day. So what did a typical day look like? The bullwhacker woke before dawn, usually around 4 a.m. The oxen had been turned loose the night before to graze, and the first task was rounding them up. This could take an hour or more if the oxen had wandered far. Once the oxen were gathered, each pair had to be yoked. Remember, each yoke weighed 40 to 60 pounds. Lifting the yoke onto the necks of 2 half-ton animals that might not want to cooperate was difficult work. Multiply that by 6 pairs and you've spent another hour just getting ready to move. By the time the wagon was ready to roll, it was usually around 6 a.m., sometimes later. The sun would just be coming up. Then the day's haul began. The bullwhacker would take his position on the left side of the leaders and start walking. The whip would crack, the oxen would lean into their yokes, the wagon would creak forward, 2 miles per hour, for the next 10 to 12 hours. There was no lunch break. The bullwhacker ate while walking, usually jerky, hardtack, maybe some dried fruit if he had it. The oxen would graze as they walked, snatching mouthfuls of grass when they could. The only real breaks came when the wagon had to cross a river, navigate a steep grade, or repair something that broke. Otherwise, it was constant forward movement. Around 5 or 6 p.m., the wagon would stop for the night. The bullwhacker would unyoke the oxen, another hour of work, turn them loose to graze, then tend to the wagon, grease the axles, check the wheels, inspect the cargo, repair any damage from the day's travel. By the time all that was done, it might be 8 p.m. The bullwhacker would eat, usually beans, bacon, coffee, more hardtack, and collapse into his bedroll. 4 hours of sleep, maybe 5. Then up again at 4 a.m. to do it all over again, for 6 months straight. The monotony was psychological torture. The landscape barely changed. The work was exactly the same every single day. Walk beside the oxen, crack the whip, watch the horizon crawl closer at 2 miles per hour. Many bullwhackers talked to their oxen constantly just to hear a human voice, even if it was their own. They'd sing songs, recite poetry, tell stories to the animals, anything to break the silence. Some men went a little mad from it. There are accounts of bullwhackers arriving at their destinations unable to stop walking, their bodies so conditioned to the constant movement that standing still felt wrong. Now, let's talk about the obstacles. Rivers were the most dangerous challenge. Unlike settlers on the Oregon Trail, freight wagons couldn't just unhitch and float across. These wagons weighed multiple tons when loaded. They had to be driven across, through the water, with the oxen pulling against the current. Scout the crossing point carefully. Look for a spot where the banks were gradual enough for the oxen to enter and exit without the wagon tipping. Check the bottom for soft sand or mud that might bog down the wheels. Then drive in. The oxen would balk at the water's edge. The bullwhacker would have to coax them forward, sometimes wading into the river himself to lead the leaders by hand. Once in, the current would try to push the wagon downstream. The oxen would struggle against the flow, their heads just above water, eyes wide with fear. The wagon would lurch and sway. Water would pour through the floorboards, soaking the cargo. If the bottom was soft, the wheels might sink. If the current was too strong, the wagon might tip. If an ox panicked, the entire team could become tangled in their yokes and drown. River crossings killed more bullwhackers than anything else, except accidents with the wagons themselves. Speaking of accidents, those were constant. A loaded freight wagon was a death trap on wheels. 3 to 4 tons of cargo sitting high on a wooden frame, rolling on wheels with no suspension, pulled by animals that could spook or stumble without warning. The most common fatal accident? Getting run over. It happened like this. The bullwhacker would be walking beside the wagon when an ox stumbled, or the wagon hit a rock, or the team suddenly lurched forward. The bullwhacker would lose his footing and fall. Before he could scramble clear, a wheel would roll over him. Remember, these wheels carried 3 tons of cargo. A wheel rolling over a man's leg would crush the bone to splinters, over his chest or skull. Instant death. Some bullwhackers survived being run over, but with permanent injuries, shattered legs, crushed feet, broken backs. Without proper medical care, many of these injuries became infected. Gangrene set in. Men died slowly, days or weeks after the initial accident. Descending steep grades was particularly treacherous. Going uphill, the oxen pulled. Going downhill, they had to hold the wagon back, and a fully loaded freight wagon wanted to roll downhill very badly. The bullwhacker would lock the rear wheels with a chain called a rough lock, essentially turning the rear wheels into skids that dragged along the ground. Even with the wheels locked, the wagon could still slide, pushing the oxen ahead of it. If the rough lock broke, or if the grade was too steep, the wagon would begin to roll freely. The oxen would panic and try to run. The wagon would overtake them. Oxen, yokes, wagon, cargo. Everything would tumble down the slope in a massive, deadly tangle of wood, metal, and screaming animals. When that happened, the bullwhacker could only watch. If he was lucky, he wasn't caught in it. If he was unlucky, he was crushed along with everything else. Broken axles were another constant problem. The axles were solid wood, and under constant stress from the weight and the rough terrain, they would crack or snap. When that happened, the wagon would collapse on one side, spilling cargo everywhere. Repairing a broken axle in the middle of nowhere meant finding a suitable tree, cutting it down, shaping a new axle with hand tools, then jacking up the 3-ton wagon, using nothing but wooden poles and rocks as levers to install the replacement. This could take an entire day, sometimes longer, and the bullwhacker had to do it alone or with minimal help from other teamsters if he was traveling in a wagon train. The isolation was profound. Solo bullwhackers, men hauling a single wagon on their own, might go weeks without seeing another human being. The prairie was vast and empty. You could look in any direction and see nothing but grass and sky to the horizon. At night, after unyoking the oxen and tending the wagon, the bullwhacker would sit by his small fire and eat his meager dinner in complete silence. No conversation, no human contact, just the sound of the oxen grazing and the wind moving through the grass. Many bullwhackers kept journals, writing by firelight. The entries were usually brief and repetitive, traveled 16 miles, good grass, no water. Day after day, the same terse observations. Some entries revealed the psychological toll. Have not spoken to another man in 23 days. I'm beginning to forget the sound of my own voice. The danger wasn't just loneliness, it was also vulnerability. A man alone with a wagon full of valuable cargo was a tempting target for outlaws. Some bullwhackers were robbed and murdered, their bodies left beside their wagons, the oxen wandering loose until someone found them weeks later. For safety, many bullwhackers traveled in wagon trains, groups of 5 to 50 wagons moving together. The larger freighting companies organized massive trains. Russell, Majors, and Waddell, the biggest freighting outfit on the plains, sometimes ran trains of over 100 wagons. These wagon trains moved like slow-motion military convoys. The wagons would spread out during the day to avoid each other's dust, then circle up at night for protection. The bullwhackers would share meals, swap stories, play cards. The loneliness was broken by companionship. But even in a wagon train, each bullwhacker was responsible for his own team and wagon. The work didn't get easier just because there were others around. And the pay? That's where the real insult came in. A bullwhacker earned between $20 and $40 per month, depending on the route and the employer. For a 6-month journey from Nebraska City to Salt Lake City, that meant $120 to $240 total, if he was lucky and the company actually paid him at the end. Some freighting companies paid in script, essentially IOUs that could only be redeemed at company stores. The prices at those stores were inflated, meaning the bullwhacker's actual purchasing power was much less than his nominal wages. Compare that to the value of what he was hauling. A wagon load of mining equipment worth $5,000 to $10,000, transported 1,000 miles for a wage of $150 to $200. The economics were brutal. But here's what made men take the job. There were no qualifications required. You didn't need education. You didn't need land. You didn't need family connections or capital. You just needed to be willing to walk beside oxen for 6 months. For young men with nothing, immigrants fresh off the boat, former soldiers with no skills, drifters looking for work, bullwhacking was one of the few jobs available. It was hard, lonely, dangerous work. But it was work. And some men did it for years. They'd complete a westbound journey, turn around and drive an empty wagon back east, then load up and head west again. 2 trips per year if they were lucky. 8 to 12 months on the trail, then a few weeks in Kansas or Missouri before starting over. These professional bullwhackers developed deep knowledge of the routes. They knew every river crossing, every campsite with good grass, every shortcut that could save a day. They knew which trails turned to impassable mud in spring, which mountain passes closed earliest in winter. The best bullwhackers could read weather, read terrain, read their oxen's behavior. They could sense when an ox was going lame before it showed obvious signs. They could judge a river's current by watching the surface. They could estimate distances by the sound of their own footsteps. This knowledge made them valuable. A skilled bullwhacker could command higher wages, maybe $50 or even $60 per month. The big freighting companies would compete to hire the best men. Some bullwhackers eventually saved enough to buy their own wagons and teams. They'd become independent operators, contracting directly with merchants or miners. The profit potential was much higher. A successful independent freighter could make $500 to $1,000 per trip after expenses. But the risk was also higher. You owned the wagon. You owned the oxen. If something went wrong, a broken axle in the middle of nowhere, a stampede that scattered your team, a river crossing that drowned half your oxen, you absorbed the loss. Many independent freighters went bankrupt after a single disastrous trip. The golden age of the bullwhacker was brief, roughly 1850 to 1870. 20 years, that's all. The railroads killed the profession. As rail lines extended westward, first to Denver, then to Salt Lake City, then across the entire continent, the need for overland freight wagons disappeared almost overnight. Why wait 6 months for a wagon when a train could deliver the same cargo in 6 days? By 1870, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete. By 1880, branch lines reached most major towns and mining districts. The freight wagon became obsolete. Some bullwhackers adapted. They found work with smaller outfits serving remote areas the railroads didn't reach, mountain mining camps, isolated ranches, towns too small to warrant a rail spur. Others left freighting entirely. They became ranch hands, farm laborers, miners, saloon keepers. Some even became railroad workers, helping to build the very system that had made their former profession obsolete. A few kept working into the 1880s and beyond, hauling freight to the last remaining places the railroad couldn't reach. But the work was sporadic, the pay lower, the opportunities shrinking year by year. By 1890, bullwhacking as a profession had essentially vanished. The men who had moved an entire civilization westward at 2 miles per hour were forgotten. Their skills, reading the weather, managing ox teams, navigating by landmarks, became irrelevant in an age of steel rails and steam engines. But here's what they accomplished. Between 1850 and 1870, freight wagons transported millions of tons of cargo across the American West. Every mining camp, every frontier town, every isolated settlement received its supplies via wagon. The nails that built the houses, the tools that dug the mines, the food that kept people alive through winter, all of it arrived behind teams of oxen, guided by men walking beside them at 2 miles per hour. The economic impact was staggering. The freighting industry employed thousands of men: bullwhackers, wagon builders, harness makers, blacksmiths, livestock breeders. It generated millions of dollars in revenue. It connected isolated settlements to the commercial networks of the East. Without the bullwhackers, Western expansion would have been impossible. The gold rush towns would have starved. The mining camps would have lacked equipment. The settlers would have had no supplies. The railroads get the credit for opening the West. They built the permanent infrastructure, the steel arteries that connected the continent. But before the railroads arrived, it was the freight wagons that did the work. And the men who walked beside those wagons, they were the forgotten pioneers, not the flashy cowboys of legend, not the gunfighters and outlaws, not the prospectors striking it rich, just men walking beside oxen day after day, mile after mile, moving America westward one agonizing step at a time, for $30 a month. Today, almost nothing remains. The wagon trails have been paved over or plowed under. The freighting companies are long gone. The names of individual bullwhackers are mostly lost to history. But if you drive across Kansas or Nebraska or Wyoming and you look carefully at the landscape, you can still see traces. Faint depressions in the prairie where thousands of wagon wheels wore grooves into the earth. Places where the grass grows differently because the soil was compacted by the passage of countless wagons. The ruts are still there if you know where to look. And somewhere in those ruts, you can imagine a man walking beside 12 oxen, a 20-foot whip in his hand, moving at 2 miles per hour toward a horizon that never seems to get any closer. That was the bullwhacker, the man who moved America, one step at a time.